In the early hours of March the 2nd, 1953, the most powerful man in the world lay dying, alone. He had suffered a stroke at least 12 hours before. His guards were worried, but they did not dare to go into his bedroom. How could a man, worshipped by millions, be left to lie helpless, soaked in his own urine?
Masha, Masha, помоги мне. Дежурное, внимание, кабинет товарища Сталина.
Stalin had built an empire on a framework of terror, justifying it in the name of a political faith. And through it, he ruled his country, his government, his party, and his family. He had even terrorized the doctors he now needed so badly. Now there was no one left, no wife, child, lover, or friend who was brave enough to enter the private world of Joseph Stalin. He had become a victim of his own terror. At the time of his death, Stalin was probably the best-known man on earth. His popularity far outstripped that of any other world leader. In the Soviet Union, his image was everywhere. He had become a living icon, the subject of a cult of personality. 160 million people felt they knew him personally. But the man they knew was an invention. The real man was a mass of contradictions. A dictator whose position was unassailable, yet who was haunted by paranoia. Stalin used terror more effectively and scientifically than any other ruler. His extreme faith in a political ideal would destroy tens of millions of lives. Yet his achievements would hold his people in awe of him to the end.
Although there were millions and millions of people who detested him, there were equally millions and millions of people who loved and revered him. And many further millions of people who detested him at the same time mourned him when he died.
It is tempting to dismiss Stalin as a psychopath, unable to form normal human relationships with others. But family photos show a warm, gentle man, surrounded by daughters, sons, aunts, and in-laws. Stalin was a passionate husband, a loving father, and even a committed friend. Despite this, most of the people in these photos would be destroyed by him.
My father was called back to Moscow. He arrived on the 18th of November. He got a phone call, and then he left immediately, and never returned.
It was a terrible time. Everyone wanted to destroy everyone else. There were betrayals, denunciations, and such hatred that crossed all normal boundaries.
It seemed to me that he had some sort of hypnotic power. He could influence people, and he used fear.
Family relationships meant nothing to him at that time.
The opening of the Russian archives in recent years has finally revealed the story of the terror that Stalin created during his journey from extreme poverty to absolute power. Stalin was a Georgian from the southern part of the Russian Empire. The village where he was born, Gori, was nearer to Baghdad than it was to St. Petersburg. This was a wild country, a land of tribalism and blood feuds. He had been baptized Yosef Vissarionovich Zhugashvili. His mother, Keke, called him Soso. Soso was born into extreme poverty. The family rented a single room in a two-room house. 3 siblings had already died in infancy. Keke invested all of her hopes in her one surviving son. She was a deeply religious woman, and she dreamed that he might become a man of God. But Soso's life was overshadowed by the violence of his father. Vissarion Zhugashvili was a shoemaker and a drunk. What little money he made, he spent on alcohol. And when he came home, which was not often, there was trouble.
His father beat his son viciously just to alleviate his own frustrations, and in fact severely wounded Stalin at the age of 7 in one of these beatings, and the left elbow never recovered. In fact, you'll see in all the photographs of Stalin this withered shorter arm, and which affected the mobility of the left hand as well. So he had reason to be terrified of his father, and I think this instilled in him the wish for revenge, and never ever in his life to be the underdog, that he must always be the top dog.
Soso could so simply have disappeared into the squalor of 19th century Georgia. But remarkably, the young boy was plucked from obscurity by a powerful patron. Yakov Ignatashvili was the answer to Keke's prayers, perhaps in more ways than one. It was rumored that the wealthy merchant was actually Soso's true father. The Ignatashvilis treated him and his mother as family, and he would protect them all his life.
His godfather, Yakov Ignatashvili, was our closest relative, and I know that Stalin would run back after classes straight to them, and they received him as a relative, because Yakov was his godfather.
Father or godfather, Yakov's patronage meant Keke could now groom Soso for his religious calling. Entry into the priesthood would admit Soso to one of the educated elites in the Tsarist Empire.
So she brought him up with this feeling that he could do no wrong. And of course a man, who is hero worshipped by his mother believes he is a hero.
The Orthodox Church underpinned the authority of the imperial family. Its priests encouraged millions of peasants to revere the Tsar. They urged them to accept the ties that bound them to the land as if they were still medieval serfs. This was the prize which Keke had in mind for her only son, who was already showing signs of talent.
This is an exceptional child, and the super intelligence, the super sensitivity of this damaged child. I mean, this was a boy who could learn, who learned to read and write much earlier than other children. And he, other children at sort of 8 or 9 were just perfecting their Georgian language, for example. But we know that he told people about how he himself had learned at 4 or 5 to read and write very well.
Soso was brought up speaking Georgian, his native language. But Georgia was part of the Russian Empire, and at school he was forced to read and write Russian. It was also a land of factions and vendettas, and he grew up learning to be a fighter. Although he was the smallest boy in his year, he was still the toughest. And at the age of 14, he won a scholarship to the Orthodox seminary in Tbilisi. The road from poverty to priesthood lay before him, but it would be a harsh journey.
When he arrived there, however, the discipline imposed on him by his priests, who were his teachers, was very, very severe, including beatings, including solitary confinement.
For Stalin, beating was the worst of punishments that you could inflict on anybody. And later on in his life, when somebody asked him about punishment, he said, beat them, it's the worst you can do to them.
The seminary at Tbilisi was not just a center for studying Christianity. Here, some of the brightest minds in Georgia were able to exchange and debate radical new ideas. They read Darwin, and now they found the works of Karl Marx. These had only recently been published in Russia.
In Tbilisi, there was only one copy of Marx's Das Kapital. It was handwritten. They got hold of it, and they used to read it at night. And of course, the seminary found out about it.
The seminary authorities would have been worried by Soso's flirtation with the new ideas. The peacock elegance of Nicholas II's court was a glittering disguise. Behind it lay an absolutist monarchy which had made few concessions to the ideas of democracy taking root elsewhere in Europe. It was a brittle regime which stifled protest using a network of secret police and the threat of exile to Siberia. The 20-year-old Soso was entranced by Marx's prediction that the Tsars would be swept away in a class war. He turned his back on his mother's dream of a career in the priesthood. Soso had found a higher calling.
The sort of Marxism that attracted him was the Marxism that was going to take on the Russian Empire, that was going to bring Tsarism crashing down. And Stalin, throughout his young manhood, saw Tsarism as being an order that brought about political oppression and economic exploitation and national hatreds. He wanted all of that to be eliminated.
Conversion to a new faith demanded a new identity. Soso was dead. He would call himself Koba, after a Georgian Robin Hood-style hero. Koba the revolutionary had a mission to spread the new gospel to the urban workers who had most to gain from Marxism. In the Black Sea port of Batumi, he organized a huge demonstration which ended in a riot. 15 were killed and many more were wounded. Koba the revolutionary had been blooded. He had his first police record. On the 9th of July 1903, he was sentenced to 3 years' exile in Siberia. If the seminary in Tbilisi had been a school for revolutionaries, Siberia would prove to be his university. Here he met a group of hard-line activists, many of whom would become leaders in the Russian Revolution.
Oftentimes they were rather like reading holidays, where a group of these revolutionaries would find themselves reading books in these very boring villages in Siberia. Every now and then they decided to escape and then would set off a yomp to the local train station, and they were only guarded often by a local old gendarme who kept a pretty unclose watch on them.
Koba could easily slip away from his exile back to Tbilisi. Here he had fallen in love with a local girl, Kato Svanidze, sister of one of his revolutionary comrades. But unlike her brother, Kato was surprisingly conventional.
I think he fell in love with his mother. She was deeply religious, this very beautiful girl that he married, and she didn't believe in politics either. It was his mother.
Koba's new love would draw him back into a world that he had only recently left. Kato and his mother wanted a church wedding. Remarkably, he agreed. But his new relationship would quickly be tested by his life as a revolutionary.
He wanted it to be his baba, as he called them, his housewife who kept traditional Georgian house for him. But on the other hand, he was always gone. He was never there. He was always on the road, in secret meetings, trips abroad, and so on. The life of a revolutionary was the opposite to that of a sort of good husband. And Kato, had a very lonely life.
Kato had to rely on her family rather than on her new husband. Now, the certainties which bounded Stalin and Kato's world were to be challenged. The year was 1905.
And in 1905, of course, Nicholas II almost was overthrown. Strikes broke out in all of the major cities. Peasants started moving against their landlords. It came very close to a full revolution. So these young revolutionaries who had read their Marx, had been rather bookish, had been drawn to doctrines of total change, suddenly became big political figures in their own right.
The unsuccessful rising created new heroes for Koba. Within weeks of marrying Kato, he left for Finland on forged papers to meet Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. What he found surprised him.
I was expecting to see the mountain eagle of our party, a great man, not only politically, but, if you will, physically. For I had formed for myself an image of Lenin as a giant, stately and imposing. What was my disappointment when I saw the most ordinary-looking man, below middle height, distinguished from ordinary mortals by nothing, literally nothing.
In Stalin, Lenin found exactly what he needed. Lenin was existing in the world of bourgeois intellectuals, exiles sitting in Viennese coffee houses, discussing dialectical materialism. What he needed in Stalin was ruthless, tough, energetic organizers in Russia itself. Men who were willing to do anything for the cause, men with nothing to lose. And Stalin was exactly that. And that's why Lenin called him my wonderful Georgian. Stalin was willing to, for example, to organize the bank robberies, the expros, the expropriations as they were called.
Lenin was impressed by Stalin's ruthlessness and organizational flair, but others in the party were less comfortable with Comrade Koba. In a world poisoned by suspicion, one incident cast particular doubt on Stalin's loyalties. For years, the Okhrana, the Tsarist police, had been searching for a secret underground printing press known to be operating in a suburb of Tbilisi. Revolutionary pamphlets were flooding the factories. Also, bombs and ammunition were known to be stored there. In 1906, the Okhrana, acting on an anonymous tip-off, raided the press and arrested several of Koba's fellow revolutionaries, and possibly rivals. Koba himself just happened to be out of town. Many suspected that Koba was the informer and an agent for the Okhrana.
People around him were double agents, single agents, quadruple agents, and Stalin himself was probably one of those. It didn't mean they weren't absolute Marxist fanatics. It just meant that they might betray people who irritated them, get rid of a rival, and make a deal maybe to get less exile. But it didn't change the fact that they were fanatics.
In 1907, whilst on the run, he heard that Kato had given birth to a boy, Yakov. He managed to get home, but not to celebrate. Weakened by the birth, Kato had succumbed to tuberculosis.
When she died, what he said was all warm feeling for people died with her. She melted my stony heart. And it was as if nobody else could ever do that again. So it's almost a betrayal that she dies, a betrayal of that love that, you know, he'd opened to her and she died. It's very complicated. He is a very complex person, there's absolutely no doubt.
Yakov, Stalin's first son, would be almost 20 before he'd see his father again. He abandoned him to the care of Kato's sisters and returned to his life of revolutionary action. Within weeks, he was back in prison, a hardened man. A fellow prisoner, Semyon Vereshchak, recalls,
"Nothing would ever upset Stalin. When executions were taking place and all the others were shaken, he slept soundly or quietly studied Esperanto. On one occasion, after a major riot, the politicals were made to run the gauntlet of soldiers' rifle butts. Stalin walked through the ordeal, calmly and bravely, reading a book."
Stalin proved his usefulness to the Bolshevik cause by his diligent work as a bank robber and agitator. His reward was a post on the party's Central Committee, and for this he would leave his quiet life in exile. He returned to St. Petersburg, traveling under a new name. From now on, he would be Stalin, the man of steel. Behind the facade of St. Petersburg's imperial splendor seethed an underworld of murderous revolutionary groups dedicated to overthrowing the Tsars. Stalin slipped quickly into the heart of this network of dissidents. He found a temporary home with a trusted family of radicals, the Alleluyevs. Their flat, not far from the Tsar's winter palace, was a safe house for subversives. Stalin had already met the family in Georgia. Sergei, the father, was married to Olga, a restless woman notorious for her affairs. Now Stalin became intimately involved with Sergei and his children.
Grandfather used to hide revolutionaries in his flat. The police would come, and the children would be afraid. Can you imagine the children knowing that grandfather and everyone else could go to prison? So very often he would save these revolutionaries, and that's why grandfather had lots of friends among them. The first thing they would ask was, "Are there two exits, the back door as well as the front door?" "Good, then we'll stay here." The police always came to the front door, so they could escape through the back one.
But escape wasn't an option when, in 1913, Koba was yet again picked up by the Ukraina and returned to exile. This time, it was a remote camp beyond the Arctic Circle, where he would remain for 4 miserable years. From here, he wrote wistfully to the Alleluyevs in the paradise of St. Petersburg.
"I should be happy if you would send me postcards with views of nature. In this forsaken spot, nature is reduced to stark ugliness. In summer, the river, and in winter, the snow."
Just a year into his exile, the First World War broke out. Russia mobilized millions of troops against Germany. Stalin was called up, but with his damaged arm, he was found to be unfit for military service. So he escaped the catastrophic defeats and harsh conditions, which began to undermine the Tsarist regime. In February 1917, the Tsar was overthrown.
When the news came that the Tsar had abdicated, they were totally taken by surprise, and of course they then set off from their exile on this train journey to St. Petersburg. And a very exciting train journey it must have been, with their hope of power, revolution, and the creation of their perfect socialist paradise.
Power was now in the hands of a provisional government. Lenin's faction, the Bolsheviks, formed part of the official opposition. Stalin, on his return, came directly to this house. It was a barracks for party workers. Upstairs were the editorial offices of Pravda, the Bolshevik newspaper. Stalin immediately took over as editor, but instead of following the Leninist line on an immediate end to the war and the seizure of power, Stalin went badly off message. he would soon taste Lenin's wrath. When Lenin arrived in St. Petersburg, Stalinist history recalls how, with great joy, the two leaders of Bolshevism met after their long separation. In fact, Lenin got off the train cursing the editor of Pravda. Stalin was given a telling off for his weak attitude. Despite this, he was content to follow Lenin, the real hero of the revolution. But he loathed the intellectual arrogance of the silver-tongued Leon Trotsky. Trotsky's brilliance far eclipsed Stalin in those early years.
Stalin was not one of the great orators. His Georgian accent told against him. He was nervous about giving big political speeches. But what he was good at was at editing newspapers, organizing the revolution within the Central Committee.
Stalin's role lacked glory, but it was practical.
He was Lenin's secret factotum. He was useful to Lenin because he was lesser known to the police than, say, Trotsky. Trotsky was a European figure already. He was famous. And that was only true of Lenin and Trotsky and not of most of the others.
Lenin now approved of Stalin's skills in editing Pravda, and he had other strengths. On the 3rd of July, the Bolsheviks tried to seize power for themselves, but the plot backfired. Trotsky was arrested, and a warrant was issued for Lenin. Stalin, the quiet man, plucked Lenin from danger and took him to the Alleluyev's safe house.
Lenin was at my grandfather's flat for about 36 hours. His beard had to be shaved off, and so to begin with, my grandmother started to shave his beard. Stalin said, "Get away, you can't do it, let me." And so he finished shaving him. He shaved his beard off, and then they put my grandfather's coat on Lenin and rammed a cap on his head. And looking like this, he was escorted to the railway station.
Stalin, the master of misinformation, successfully disguised the agitator who would become one of the most recognizable men in history. Lenin's second chance to hijack the revolution came in October 1917. Russia was in crisis as her army crumbled before the Germans. The Bolsheviks harnessed the discontent of soldiers and sailors in St. Petersburg and mounted a coup against the provisional government. They surrounded the Winter Palace with artillery and forced the government out of power. Stalin was immediately offered a job as a people's commissar in Lenin's government. He later joined the inner circle of power, the Politburo. For a secretary, he chose one of the daughters of his old friends, the Alleluyevs, the 16-year-old Nadezhda.
She was a little girl when she met Stalin, and they had terrific fun with him. They went sleigh rides. Stalin used to read to them. He would read Chekhov short stories to them, and they would laugh a lot. Apparently, Nadia was a very boisterous, rather mischievous child and liked to play jokes, and So would laugh and joke with them. And I mean, other times they found him quite solemn and introverted, but he also did have this humorous side, which they really loved.
Stalin was old enough to be Nadezhda's father, but she was entranced by him, and she shared his revolutionary passion. When the encroaching Germans forced the new government to move to the safety of Moscow, Nadezhda went with him. Here, Lenin's government was in trouble. Although they had signed a humiliating peace with the Germans in 1918, they faced new enemies. Forces loyal to the Tsar were massing in corners of the old Russian Empire. Lenin had to defend his revolution ruthlessly, using what he called war communism and the terror tactics once harnessed in the French Revolution.
За эту самоуверенность нам приходится расплачиваться жизнями пролетариата-грабительскими войнами.
There was enormous resistance to Lenin and the Bolsheviks, even from the working class. That meant that it wasn't going to be an easy revolution at all, that there was going to be civil war.
Civil war would use Stalin's talents as an organizer, an agitator who could push men into desperate action. The skills he had honed in orchestrating bank robberies now had real value. There was a problem in the south. Essential grain supplies simply weren't getting through to the cities. Stalin left Moscow on a train packed with militia to sort it out. His destination was the city of Tsaritsyn.
Stalin and his top people learnt to be killers, and they learnt the glamour of macho expeditions into the countryside, riding shotgun in armored trains with detachments of Cheka, secret policemen or Red Guards, riding out there to execute massive numbers of aristocrats or bourgeois or whatever. And in these expeditions, they felt they were living the power and glamour of revolution.
Aboard Stalin's war train thundering south was his 16-year-old secretary, Nadezhda. Her brother Fyodor was also on the train. Returning to his carriage from the dining saloon, Fyodor heard his sister cry out.
Nadya!
Allegedly, Stalin started to rape her. I read this rubbish somewhere. But really, she was very much in love with him. Why would he rape her if she was so much in love with him?
Nadezhda and Stalin were man and wife from that day on. Their Bolshevik marriage would be solemnized in a bloodbath, as around them dozens of people were being executed.
He behaved with the macho violence of a Bolshevik in command. He secured the grain. When he had prisoners on a barge, he sunk the barge with all prisoners on deck. I mean, nothing was too much for Stalin. No excess of violence was too much in order to make sure that Moscow got its grain, that Tsaritsyn didn't fall. For the first time, he had absolute power, and he learned how to use it. He learned one of the ruling rules of his life: one man, one problem, no man, no problem.
In 1921, Stalin masterminded the Bolshevik seizure of his homeland, Georgia, which had declared itself independent of Russia. Stalin said, "We must draw a white-hot iron across this Georgian land." His swaggering behavior led him to clash fiercely with his Georgian Bolshevik comrades. Nadia understood Stalin's harsh world. She too was a committed Bolshevik, and she recognized that revolutions called for blood. Back in Moscow, Stalin and Nadezhda lived in the Kremlin, the former home of the Tsars, in true communist fashion.
We began living with Stalin and Nadezhda Sergeyeva, and several others too, in a communal flat, with one kitchen for several families. They were comfortable enough, and the comrades were all friends, and so they didn't want to part, and their wives were all friends too. So they carried on living there, and even though there was one kitchen, you had your own flat, so you could go to your own private room if you wanted. Then, in 1921, Vasily was born, and the flat became too small for Stalin, so he had to move.
Although Stalin now had a family, he would not allow it to compromise his revolutionary zeal. A letter recently unearthed in one of the state archives shows how determined he was to prove his proletarian credentials.
It's to the head of state, Kalinin, and it's complaining bitterly. I've moved into my new flat in the Kremlin, and I'm absolutely furious to discover that somebody has gone and bought a whole lot of new smart furniture for my flat. This is directly against my orders. I'm very angry about this. I gave express orders that I was to have old furniture in my flat. More than that, he writes, "Find the culprit and punish him." And he signs off, "With communist greetings, J. Stalin."
Both Stalin and Nadia, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, had very similar ideals, which were social justice and equality and fair working conditions and so on. Nadia was one of the first emancipated women. Women got equal rights at the revolution, and she went for them. She wanted education, she wanted independence. She wasn't going to change her name when she got married.
Худо оказалось немного много, но добра немного мало. Но добро все же было. Пролетариат не боится рассказать о своих трудностях.
As leader of the party, Lenin was burdened by a huge workload. He was relying on Stalin more and more. A new job was created for Stalin, General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party. He was free to write his own job description. It would make him the most powerful man in the party. The Civil War had left the country in ruins. Transport had broken down. Food was no longer reaching the cities. So Lenin relaxed the policy of collectivizing land and seizing grain. Let the peasants sell their grain. Let the free market unlock the shortages.
So this was a big retreat from Bolshevism. Lenin was the ultimate Machiavellian pragmatist, and he argued this very hard, that this had to be done. But a lot of the young Bolsheviks, believed that this was a compromise too far and that it threatened the revolution and that one day they'd have to deal with the peasant problem. But nonetheless, Lenin got the NEP, as it was called, brought in.
Lenin had exhausted himself in holding the revolution together. In May 1922, he suffered the first of a series of strokes. Over the next few months, he recovered some of his former strength, but he became concerned that he would no longer be able to control his increasingly powerful colleague, Comrade Stalin. As Lenin weakened through the winter of 1922, his fears about Stalin grew. In December, Stalin persuaded the Central Committee to make him responsible for Lenin's medical care. Now he had control over the man he had once served.
He changed when he understood he could become the leader. It's probably the psychology of somebody who wants power, who loves power, and knows how to use power. That's how he was. His yes meant yes, and his no meant no. He didn't say a lot.
He built an invisible wall around the leader, forbidding access to him and strictly controlling contact with others. He then heard that Lenin had dictated a memo to his archenemy Trotsky. Lenin's devoted wife Krupskaya was acting as his secretary. Stalin now telephoned her.
Соедините с Крупской.
Krupskaya's account of the extraordinary conversation would almost destroy him.
Товарищ Крупская, здравствуйте, это Сталин.
Я очень прошу, тоже не надо вам заниматься не своим делом. Есть партия, есть политбюро.
Есть мы, товарищи, которые разберемся со всем, чем надо.
А вы не лезьте.
Я 30 лет в партии. Для меня интересы партии и народа выше всего.
Не лезьте в это дело, я вас очень прошу, не лезьте.
Я прошу вас, никто из товарищей никогда не говорил со мной в таком тоне.
Слышишь меня,
Что?
сука?
Сука сифилитичная!
Я сказал не лезть, курва поганая.
До свидания.
One always hears about Stalin, the highly controlled Iceman. Well, in fact, he also had this tempestuous, fiery Georgian temper that he couldn't control. And this is an example of a man who's supposed to be this great political machine, but in fact, at the vital moment, he loses his temper and almost loses everything.
Stalin had gone too far in abusing Krupskaya. Lenin was now dictating what he called his testament to the party. He was already incensed by Stalin's aggressive behavior towards his party colleagues in Georgia. When he heard about the phone call to his wife, he added a devastating condemnation of Stalin.
Еще одно дополнение. Сталин слишком груб. Слишком груб. И хотя это становится терпимо среди друзей коммунистов. Но совершенно недопустимо на должности генсека партии.
The testament was sealed in an envelope and given to Krupskaya to be opened after Lenin's death. One of his secretaries, however, leaked the fact to Stalin that Lenin meant to finish him. It was to be done at the next Communist Party Congress in 1923 by Trotsky, acting on Lenin's behalf. But the wily Stalin offered Trotsky a political concession in return for temporarily dropping the issue. Trotsky fell for it. Stalin was reprieved, and the chance to halt his grim progress was lost forever. Lenin had foreseen the danger in an all-powerful Stalin. The protégé would now go on to eclipse the worst excesses of his master.
I remember we were taken to the building where Lenin's body was lying. I remember that we went up the stairs and that everything was covered in black cloth. Halfway up the stairs, two boys were crying, and then all the little children passed by the body. We didn't really know what was going on, but we knew that something horrible had happened.
At the funeral, Stalin read an extraordinary evangelical tribute to his leader.
Comrade Lenin ordained us to hold high and keep pure the great title of member of the party. We vow to thee that we shall fulfill thy commandment.
Stalin would now use Lenin's name to destroy those who stood between him and absolute power. There was to be a collective leadership, but his main rival was Trotsky, the darling of the party. For 20 years, Stalin had lived in Trotsky's shadow. His fame as the charismatic orator and leader of the victorious Red Army during the Civil War matched that of Lenin himself. Trotsky had described Stalin as a grey bureaucrat, a mediocrity. It was a fatal underestimation of Stalin's political skill and of his unswerving hatred. Stalin now had control of the party machinery. He would use it over the next 6 years to destroy Trotsky and all his other rivals. Henceforth, Trotsky's name would become synonymous with heresy. Stalin won the support of the party by elevating Lenin to the status of a hero and a prophet. The man who had tried to destroy him would now be used to justify Stalin's vision of the future.
He immediately took over the intellectual side of Lenin, and he controlled it absolutely, and he decided what of Lenin's work was published and what wasn't. And his embalmment of Lenin and displaying Lenin in the mausoleum was the deliberate creation of a religion of Bolshevism and of a religious symbol for Bolshevism, which worked.
By 1929, Russia had only just matched the level of industrialization achieved before the First World War. As the increasingly powerful General Secretary, Stalin embarked on a mission to make Russia leap forward half a century in the space of just a few years.
He wanted to make the Soviet Union into an industrial colossus and a military power to be reckoned with on the European mainland. He wanted Soviet modernity. He wanted an end to the old Russia of the peasant, of the village, of the Christian faith. And he wanted virtually an industrialized countryside to take the place of the medieval Muscovy that he so much detested.
In the cities, Stalin mobilized an army of enthusiastic young communists to help crush anyone who might oppose his plans. They flooded out of Moscow and St. Petersburg into the countryside. Their mission was to drag the peasants into the 20th century. If the peasants didn't cooperate, they would be destroyed. The master of propaganda now showed town dwellers in films such as this how it was a richer class of peasants, or kulaks, that were responsible for food shortages by hoarding grain. Lists of the guilty were published.
He expropriated their property and he deported most of them to Siberia for at least 5 years.
Bolshevik squads now seized thousands of tons of grain across the countryside. The peasants would starve. For those who dared to hoard grain, Stalin had a solution, a new law, Protocol 111. They called it the 5-ear law. You could be shot for stealing 5 grains of corn. Stalin had unleashed his army of Bolsheviks against the peasants, but now the situation was spiraling out of control. He was worried, but he imposed his will regardless.
The deliberateness of the violence and the terror is fascinating. We now know from documents that they divided the peasants into 3 categories. Category 1, to be shot instantly. Category 2, to be deported to camps, the gulags. Category 3, to be deported into exile. And gradually this sort of expanded into a civil war against the countryside. And it was done by tens of thousands of young workers from the cities who went out into the countryside and did this and saw the people starving and saw the people being shot. But they believed it was right because it was the way to paradise. It was the way to heaven on earth, the workers' paradise, and it was all worthwhile.
Hundreds of thousands of peasants were deported into the eastern wastelands. They were making the same journey the young Koba himself had made many times, but they were not expected to return. They were destined for camps where they would be starved and worked to death in conditions of absolute brutality. For most, exile would become another word for the death sentence. The freezing tundra swallowed hundreds of thousands of families.
Stalin executed a radical turn, the Great Turn he called it, the Stalin Revolution. And the Stalin Revolution was in fact a much more dramatic change in the life of the Russian people than even the Lenin Revolution of 1917. It changed everything. Of course there was resistance, and the resistance was from Stalin's sort of partners in government, Bukharin and the rightists. And Stalin easily defeated them, and they recanted and agreed to follow the party line. I mean, Stalin believed that any number of victims, any number of human casualties were worth it in order to achieve deferred paradise, the deferred paradise of socialism.
Between 1929 and 1933, up to 5 million people perished. Instead of creating communal farms, they were now digging communal graves. Stalin suppressed any mention of this in the cities, even though almost 30 million people were starving.
I went to the city of Kharkov. I was in a good compartment, and when I opened the window, like this, there was a horrible famine going on outside. I saw on the railway platform old people with swollen stomachs who were starving. And when my mother told Stalin, he said it's an illusion. She's only a child. Only he could say things like that.
Stalin's behavior was beginning to scare people. His wife, Nadezhda, in particular.
She wasn't meant to know about this. But of course she picked it up from her friends in the academy who used to go out to the countryside, and they would come back and tell her what was happening. And Stalin wasn't telling her. So this caused, enormous distress to her, and of course division in the marriage.
He was an Oriental man, and they have different ideas. They think that women are weak, but in fact she was very strong. And probably their two characters clashed, and of course they had rows about it.
Certainly 1931, according to her sister Anna, she was packing her bags. She was going to finish her studies at the academy. She was going back to Leningrad, as it now was, to live with her father and set up her own career and take her children because she'd had enough.
Stalin now controlled the destiny of millions, but not that of his own family. In 1926, a daughter, Svetlana, had been born. Stalin doted on her, but not so on the boys. His first son, Yakov, had now joined them in the Kremlin, but Stalin's constant bullying of the teenager had driven him in desperation to shoot himself. He survived, much to his father's disgust. Huh, sneered Stalin. He can't even shoot straight. Stalin's wife was equally unsympathetic to Yakov's cry for attention. She had her own concerns.
Nadia clearly had severe psychological problems. I mean, Svetlana herself said her mother was schizophrenic. Molotov said she was psychopathic. But the point was that she was a hysteric.
Nadezhda could no longer cope with the pressures of living with Stalin, or with the news of what was happening in the country.
Nadezhda Sergeyevna, Vasily and I went to Red Square. And soon Nadezhda, well, maybe in 15 or 20 minutes, literally started to moan. Oh my head, she clutched her head and literally started to moan, and a couple of minutes later went home.
The next day, Nadezhda saw the children, Vasily and Svetlana, for the last time. That evening, they were having dinner with the Molotovs and the Voroshilovs.
The Voroshilovs, as usual, were holding their revolution party after all the parades and so on. Down the table was General Yegorov's wife, Galina. And Stalin began to flirt with her in the clumsy way that he did flirt with people, drunkenly, by tossing balls of bread at her. That was his sort of way of flirting. He did it with children to entertain them too. Coarse and clumsy, it certainly was. He didn't notice his young wife's lovely dress and her new hairdo. He didn't notice anything about her. Suddenly, there was a toast, and she didn't drink to it.
Я вам не ты. У меня есть имя.
And then she got up suddenly and ran out. But Molotov's wife followed her out. They walked around the Kremlin and they talked. And she said, why does Stalin have to flirt with all these women? He's flirted with Yegorova, the actress at the dinner. He's flirted with the hairdresser in the Kremlin, who he may be having an affair with. And they agreed between them that men were men. They were silly things. But Polina told her, she said, Stalin's under immense pressure. You can't put him under more pressure when he's already fighting a civil war in the countryside. No one knows why, when she left Polina Molotov quiet, she then worked herself into a frenzy when she was in her room. She got out the little pistol that her brother had brought back from Berlin, and then she wrote a letter attacking Stalin personally and politically.
When he stood by her open coffin in a sense, to take his parting from her. He said she went away as an enemy, and he turned round and walked away. And that is according to his daughter Svetlana.
The coffin stood in the room, surrounded by people. Stalin approached the coffin and wept. What's more, he wept so strongly that he was shaking all over. It was absolutely clear he couldn't control himself. It was the most horrible thing that could have happened to him. Such grief. Vasily was clutching at him. "Daddy, don't cry. Daddy, don't cry. Please don't cry."
For Stalin, it was a huge betrayal. She had publicly said, by leaving a letter, that she thought Stalin's policies were wrong, and she agreed with Bukharin's ideas, and that she found it intolerable and that she couldn't live with it, and she would commit suicide. So not only was it a personal tragedy, it was a political betrayal, and it was on that level, principally, that he took it.
Nadezhda's death marked the end of what for Stalin had been a relatively calm and secure period of domestic life. The space that she left, he filled with his affection for Svetlana, whom he now referred to as the lady of the house. She was even allowed to appear at Politburo dinners. For male company, always important to him, he had his old friend Kirov. Kirov, when he wasn't in his office in Leningrad, spent more and more time at Stalin's dacha.
Kirov took the place of Nadia in a way, as his comfort and as his dear friend. For example, he would only go to the baths with Kirov. Among his political fraternity, he would only take his clothes off in Kirov's company, for example. He would only swim with Kirov. This relationship was very close, and yet there were severe political tensions in it. And one of the tensions was that at the 17th Congress in 1934, a group of Bolsheviks, disenchanted after the horrors of collectivization, planned to overthrow Stalin and place Kirov as leader of the party.
Kirov was Stalin's closest friend, and now suddenly he was also his closest rival and a serious threat. On the 1st of December 1934, at Kirov's office in Leningrad, a lone gunman stalked the corridor.
Suddenly there was a telephone call. It was an intercity call. You could tell by the ringing. Stalin took the receiver, and as my mother told me, he turned pale. His face went completely strange. He put down the receiver and said, "Kirov has been killed. I'm going to Leningrad."
He left for Leningrad with his own court of judges, prosecutors, and executioners.
Within hours of finding out about Kirov's death, Stalin had drafted the 1st of December law, which gave him the power to essentially shoot anyone accused of terrorism very quickly.
On arrival, he personally interrogated Kirov's assassin, Nikolaev. Stalin claimed that he implicated the followers of another leading member of the old Bolshevik Guard, Zinoviev. Nikolaev was quickly executed. Then he had the assassin's wife, brother, and sister-in-law shot without trial. He identified and arrested Zinoviev's supporters and had them all shot. His old colleagues Zinoviev and Kamenev were seized in Moscow. It isn't known whether or not Stalin ordered Kirov's death, but he had drafted the law allowing the arrests and executions within 2 hours of hearing the news.
The 1st of December law was to be the basis of his personal dictatorship. it was also to be the foundation of the terror of the 30s.
Within a year, over 100,000 people in Leningrad alone would be imprisoned or shot. In time, most of the 2,000 delegates who'd attended the 17th Party Congress would be killed. Too many had voted in favor of Kirov. If the party wouldn't follow Stalin, he would build one that would. The initial trial of Zinoviev and Kamenev was a sham, but after being promised light sentences, they confessed.
He had brought the Georgian vendetta, the Caucasian blood feud, he had brought to Moscow, to Muscovy. He'd brought it north. And he was very much determined to destroy, physically destroy, the people who had opposed him, who had crossed him, and who he had not forgiven.
He is a Georgian, and the Georgians have a history, a very bloody history, of ruthlessness. And you didn't just annihilate your enemy, you stamped on his grave.
In 1936, at the first of the infamous show trials before the international press, Kamenev and Zinoviev were retried, found guilty, and executed, despite Stalin's promises that their lives would be spared. The terror spread in a series of shockwaves throughout the Soviet Union. In the midst of it all, Stalin went with his children to visit his mother, Keke. Now 75, she was looked after on Stalin's behalf by the head of the Georgian NKVD, Lavrenti Beria. Keke knew what was going on.
Friends would visit her who knew about arrests in Georgia and Russia, and they would complain to her because she was his mother. She didn't like it, and when he came to say his final goodbye to her, I forget why she died. I forget what illness, but she was very old. She told him, "Son, it would have been better if you had been a priest."
The man who could have been a priest was in fact playing God.
It was a religious terror, essentially, I believe. Stalin himself said that we had to kill people because they've lost faith. People were killed not for their conscious sins, but for their unconscious ones, for the fact that they might sin, they might turn against the project, they might show a lack of faith in Stalinism, in Bolshevism.
Stalin took a close personal interest in the terror as it assumed a life of its own.
He actually decided to kill people like industrial production targets. So, for example, Stalingrad was told, you're to shoot, say, 5,000 people and exile 20,000 people. So the amazing thing that we've discovered about Stalin in the last sort of few years is that the terror was organized deliberately from the center, and that Stalin and his leaders didn't care who they killed. It was done by quota, by numbers, and not even by name.
In 1 year, arrests for counter-revolutionary crimes increased tenfold. But Russian state archives revealed that Stalin still had time to pick out individuals for destruction.
Here's a chilling document that comes from the height of the terror. It's the 22nd of November 1938. It's headed Top Secret, and it's a very, very laconic, very Stalinist message. Comrade Malenkov, Moscovin must be arrested. J. Stalin. Very simple. Moscovin, who was a top official in the Comintern and an ex-Chekist, ex-secret policeman, was indeed arrested and shot very soon after this note.
Stalin's orders were carried out by a troika, a traveling court that simply read out the charges and supervised the executions.
Приговорить гражданина дашаянца Марлена Саркисовича к высшей мере наказания по статье 28 прим за измену Родине. Приговор окончательный и обжалованию не подлежит. Приговор привести к исполнению немедленно. 3 декабря 1938 года.
Stalin personally signed for execution almost 400 lists of names, totaling about 40,000 people. During the terror, around 700,000 men and women were sentenced to death. On the 12th of December 1937 alone, Stalin and Molotov approved 3,167 death sentences before breaking to go to the cinema. Stalin had killed most of those who had been part of the revolution. He now turned his attention to another of his former allies, one of the original Bolshevik leaders, Nikolai Bukharin.
Bukharin is probably the most charming and one of the most gifted and one of the most unusual of the Bolshevik leaders. I mean, Lenin called him the darling of the party, and he was. He was delightful.
Bukharin would be forced to endure the humiliation of a public show trial. He knew he was never going to escape the condemned cell. But in his last letter to Stalin, he appealed to his old friendship and showed that he still loved the cause, even if not the man.
If I am to receive the death sentence, then I implore you, by all you hold dear, not to have me shot. Let me drink poison in my cell instead. But I am preparing myself mentally to depart from this vale of tears. And there is nothing in me toward all of you, toward the party and the cause, but enormous and boundless love. For that reason, I embrace you in my mind. Farewell forever, and remember kindly your wretched Nikolai Bukharin.
Now, no one was safe. No one was closer to Stalin than his long-serving secretary, Alexander Poskrevishov. No one, that is, except Poskrevishov's wife, Bronislava. According to her daughter Natalia, she was having an affair with Stalin. One day in 1939, she vanished.
My father thought she'd gone to the dacha, so he phoned, but she wasn't there. In the morning, he asked Stalin about it, and Stalin said, "I don't know anything. Ask Beria." Beria said that she had links with Trotskyism, and she was therefore an enemy of the people.
She had been arrested. 2 years later, she would be shot. But before her death, Poskrevishov had already taken a new wife. His first wife had ceased to exist, and still Poskrevishov served his leader.
Papa couldn't do anything about it. She was accused of links with Trotskyism. Trotsky was an ideological enemy, and besides, Stalin had his own score to settle with Trotsky. So when you were accused of that, there was no hope of pardon. You have to understand, he had 2 little girls to look after. I think he did it for us.
Now, these 2 faded photographs are all that remain of Bronislava Poskrevishov, Natalia's mother, and perhaps Stalin's mistress.
My nanny told me that when I was little, Papa was looking through some photographs. It must have been 1939. I saw a picture of Mother, and I went, "Mama, Mama!" And he burst into tears and left the room.
Папа расплакался и ушел в соседнюю комнату.
The circle of terror slowly closed in on everyone, tightening and tightening until it touched his own family. He'd reached the family album, including the Georgian brother and sister-in-law of his first wife, Kato Svanidze.
The Svanitzes were locked up, she in a camp, and he in the prison, and he was shot there. And when she heard about it, she died. But before she died, she wrote a letter on a pillowcase and sent it to my mother. My mother wrote it down on paper and showed it to Stalin. And when he read it, he said, "Eugenia, don't you ever do anything like that again." And she could see by the look on his face that she'd done something really stupid. You see, because she understood that he'd crossed them out of his life, and they didn't exist for him anymore. When he put people in prison, he just forgot about them. What kind of a man is it that can do that?
There was no clear end to the terror, no specific date. But by mid-1938, Stalin had killed almost all of the 1934 Central Committee, enough of his generals to undermine the army, and enough industrial bosses to have brought the country to near standstill. Those he hadn't killed were rotting in the camps. He had almost finished. It was time to blame somebody. He chose the head of his secret police, Nikolai Yezhov.
Yezhov is the perfect person. He's now behaving like a sort of cliche of a vampire, living at night, permanently drunk, no one knows where he is, and he's still killing people crazily. So Stalin very subtly turns against him, brings up a very trusted, very tough, and much more intelligent man from Georgia, Lavrenti Beria.
The man he chose to deliver the final coup de grace was the Georgian secret policeman who'd been looking after his mother. Beria had Yezhov arrested and shot on the 4th of February 1940. The terror was very nearly over. On the 20th of August that year, a Soviet agent finally tracked down Trotsky in Mexico and plunged an ice pick into the back of his head. Stalin had once said, "There is nothing sweeter in the world than to plan revenge on an enemy, see it executed, and then go to bed to sleep peacefully." By 1940, he had fulfilled his dream by turning Russia into a great European power. And he believed that he had neutralized any threat from Nazi Germany by signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler. In the early hours of June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler's forces burst onto Russian soil along a 500-mile front. In the first day, they shot down 2,000 Soviet planes and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. It was the greatest miscalculation of his life.
The first few hours after Operation Barbarossa's start were terrible ones for Stalin. He refused to believe that what was happening really was happening, and he refused initially to allow his generals to retaliate against the German armed forces. He started to speak in a very, very low voice. He was clearly mentally shattered by what had happened.
Stalin pulled himself together and took control of Russian defenses. But after a week of ever-worsening disaster, he suddenly withdrew from the Kremlin to his dacha. It was half a crisis of confidence and half a test of loyalty for the Politburo.
They come out to the dacha, all of them, cap in hand, and he stiffens when they arrive because he thinks they've come to arrest him. He's frightened. And of course, In any other circumstances, he'd be doing the arresting. But in this case, the buck stops with Stalin, and he waits there stiffly. And he says, "What have you come for?" And they say, "We've come to ask you to come back and command the armies, take control."
On July the 3rd, Stalin broke his silence to make a speech to the nation. His delivery was described as dull and colorless. Stalin had always generated extraordinary myths and rumors, but some Russians believed his crisis of confidence at the outbreak of the war may have run far deeper.
Quite by chance, I met with a very religious person at a church near Moscow, and somebody had told him that I knew Stalin's grandchildren. I said, "I'm Tina Egnatashvili." He said, "I know this name, Egnatashvili. I believe you are related to Stalin." And as we passed the church, he drew me aside for conversation. He said, "Do you know that Stalin took confession?" I said, "Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin?" I was amazed. He confessed in 1941, 43, 45, and 48. He made these confessions to my father, and he told me that his father took the secret of the confession with him to the grave. But he had told his son, "Remember, Stalin took confession 4 times.
Is it possible that the great revolutionary Marxist had resumed his dialogue with God in the crisis of 1941?
He was clearly shattered by what had happened. However, the idea that he went into psychological meltdown is wholly untrue. He quickly gathered his strength again. Soon he was barking at his generals and bullying his political subordinates in the way he had done in recent years. He took hold of the State Committee for Defense and headed it. He took hold of military strategy. He killed the general who had been in charge of the Western Front, blaming him for the problems, for the catastrophe that he himself had caused by his own misjudgment. So he quickly reasserted himself.
Stalin ran the war as he had run everything else, single-handedly and without mercy. In August 1941, he issued Order 270, forbidding any Red Army soldier to allow himself to be taken captive. Serious punishment awaited Soviet prisoners of war should they return from captivity. Retreat was prohibited. Stalin left his forces in no doubt as to who they should fear most, him or Hitler. No sooner had the war started than Yakov, Stalin's eldest son, was captured by the Germans. Realizing his identity, they offered to return him in exchange for one of their top generals. Stalin, who had famously pronounced, "There are no Russian prisoners of war, only traitors," replied, "I have no son called Yakov."
Но я запомнила день, когда один знакомый, взрослый человек, принес
I remember the day when a person brought me an American or an English magazine with a picture of a soldier hanging dead on barbed wire, and the caption said, "My father, Jacob Stalin."
И внизу было написано, что это мой отец, то есть Яков Сталин.
Stalin decreed that the wives and families of prisoners should be treated as traitors, and his own daughter-in-law was no exception. Yakov's wife was arrested, and Stalin's only grandchild, 4-year-old Gulia, was left without parents. This doesn't even surprise Gulia.
Почему он должен был, если его невестка считалась виноватой в чем?
If his daughter-in-law was considered guilty of something, why should he treat her any different from anybody else?
Обыкновенной гражданки Советского Союза. Родственные связи.
Blood relations didn't mean anything to him at that time.
Stalin's ruthlessness, first in building an industrialized Soviet Union, and then in allowing it to be destroyed, would ultimately win the war.
One of the reasons that the USSR was successful was that they could afford to lose more tanks, more aircraft, and more men than the Germans could afford to lose. The Russians had huge industrial and human resources unavailable to Adolf Hitler.
Victory cost Stalin an estimated 26 million Russian lives. But he had won the war and conquered Eastern Europe, and his prestige and popularity had never been greater.
He had this vision, and one has to say that he did turn the tank around. The industrialization that took place over the 30 years that Stalin was in power was equivalent to about what took the rest of the Western world about 150 years. The other thing he did was he brought education and training to Russia, which had none. He changed that.
When the war was over, he was almost 70. He was now frail, exhausted. But even if his political energies were failing, his paranoia was more powerful than ever.
Stalin became more and more paranoid that people were plotting behind his back, and it was really exponential. I mean, his health went as well. He became increasingly sclerotic, and he had very high blood pressure. So his health wasn't, his physical health wasn't good either. But certainly this paranoia became more increased, I mean, to the point of a kind of psychotic paranoia, really.
His family had started to disappear as early as 1938, but for them, the terror never stopped.
It's very difficult to understand this, and the family don't understand it still to this day, because in 1947 he banished Yevgenyevna, his elder sister-in-law, first of all to prison and then to the camps. And then in 1948, Anna Sergeyevna, his younger sister-in-law.
Even his beloved Svetlana, bereft of her family, came close to disappearing.
When Svetlana said to him, "Why have you imprisoned my aunts?" he said, "Don't play the advocate, or I'll imprison you." Is it normal for a father to say things like that to his daughter?
And finally, Kira herself.
One day, about 25 days later, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd made sure I'd locked up properly because I thought that they might be coming, and I didn't want them to just get in. And there was a ring at the doorbell. My little brother Sasha answered it. He says there's 3 warrants for arrest. They were pretending there were 3, just to frighten us. It was rather confusing. Then Sasha said, "Kira, they've come for you."
So this was the sort of ultimate destruction of Stalin's family, really. And they remain there in solitary confinement. And Zhenya said afterwards that she's just survived because she thought of her children. Otherwise she might have committed suicide or given up life in the prison.
The secret police said to me, "If you write to Stalin, he'll let you out." And I said, "I'm offended. I'm not going to write to Stalin." And as it turned out, that's what saved me. Because if anyone wrote to Stalin, he put them in worse conditions. That's the kind of man he was.
Вот такой у него был характер сложный.
So now Stalin lay dying alone.
Конечно, если бы дедушка узнал, что нас посадили.
If my father had known that we were imprisoned, I don't know what he would have said. It's a lack of gratitude on Stalin's part. He lived with the family, he was hidden by the family, and he married into the family. But he said, "I'm a man of principle. I've been told that your relatives are talking too much, so I must put you all in prison. So you'll be silent there."
Ваши родственники много болтают, значит, надо вас посадить в тюрьму, что вы там помолчали. Мама входит и говорит, брат.
My mother came in and said, "Stalin's let me out of prison." And my older brother said, "You fool, Stalin's dead. He would never have let you out of prison."
On the day of Stalin's funeral, millions of Russians wept, and not just for the camera. They grieved the passing of the greatest tyrant in a century of tyrants, the man who had killed many of their friends, their neighbors, and even their families. But they had seen how his cruel revolution had made their country great. They recognized that Stalin was the last of the Russian Tsars. KK could now groom Soso for his religious calling. Entry into the priesthood would admit Soso to one of the educated elites in the Tsarist Empire.
So she brought him up with this feeling that he could do no wrong. And of course, a man, who is hero worshipped by his mother believes he is a hero.
The Orthodox Church underpinned the authority of the imperial family. Its priests encouraged millions of peasants to revere the Tsar. They urged them to accept the ties that bound them to the land as if they were still medieval serfs. This was the prize which Keke had in mind for her only son, who was already showing signs of talent.
This is an exceptional child, and the super intelligence, the super sensitivity of this damaged child. I mean, this was a boy who could learn, who learned to read and write much earlier than other children. And he, you know, other children at sort of 8 or 9 were just perfecting their Georgian language, for example. But we know that he told people about how he himself had learned at 4 or 5 to read and write very well.
Soso was brought up speaking Georgian, his native language. But Georgia was part of the Russian Empire, and at school he was forced to read and write Russian. It was also a land of factions and vendettas, and he grew up learning to be a fighter. Although he was the smallest boy in his year, he was still the toughest. And at the age of 14, he won a scholarship to the Orthodox seminary in Tbilisi. The road from poverty to priesthood lay before him, but it would be a harsh journey.
When he arrived there, however, the discipline imposed on him by his priests, who were his teachers, was very, very severe, including beatings, including solitary.
But Soso's life was overshadowed by the violence of his father. Vissarion Zhugashvili was a shoemaker and a drunk. What little money he made, he spent on alcohol. And when he came home, which was not often, there was trouble.
His father beat his son viciously just to alleviate his own frustrations, and in fact severely wounded Stalin at the age of 7 in one of these beatings, and the left elbow never recovered. In fact, you'll see in all the photographs of Stalin this withered shorter arm, and which affected the mobility of the left hand as well. So he had reason to be terrified of his father, and I think this instilled in him the wish for revenge, and never ever in his life to be the underdog, that he must always be the top dog.
Soso could so simply have disappeared into the squalor of 19th century Georgia. But remarkably, the young boy was plucked from obscurity by a powerful patron. Yakov Ignatashvili was the answer to Keke's prayers, perhaps in more ways than one. It was rumored that the wealthy merchant was actually Soso's true father. The Ignatashvilis treated him and his mother as family, and he would protect them all his life.
His godfather, Yakov Ignatashvili, was our closest relative, and I know that Stalin would run back after classes straight to them, and they received him as a relative, because Yakov was his godfather.
Father or godfather, Yakov's patronage meant
my father was called back to Moscow. He arrived on the 18th of November. He got a phone call, and then he left immediately, and never returned.
It was a terrible time. Everyone wanted to destroy everyone else. There were betrayals, denunciations, and such hatred that crossed all normal boundaries.
It seemed to me that he had some sort of hypnotic power. He could influence people, and he used fear.
Family relationships meant nothing to him at that time.
The opening of the Russian archives in recent years has finally revealed the story of the terror that Stalin created during his journey from extreme poverty to absolute power. Stalin was a Georgian from the southern part of the Russian Empire. The village where he was born, Gori, was nearer to Baghdad than it was to St. Petersburg. This was a wild country, a land of tribalism and blood feuds. He had been baptized Yosef Vissarionovich Shugashvili. His mother, Keke, called him Soso. Soso was born into extreme poverty. The family rented a single room in a two-room house. 3 siblings had already died in infancy. Keke invested all of her hopes in her one surviving son. She was a deeply religious woman, and she dreamed that he might become a man of God.
Дежурная.
In the early hours of March the 2nd, 1953, the most powerful man in the world lay dying, alone. He had suffered a stroke at least 12 hours before.
Семь, 6. Коммутатор. Дежурная.
His guards were worried, but they did not dare to go into his bedroom. How could a man, worshipped by millions, be left to lie helpless, soaked in his own urine?
Маша. Маша. Помоги мне. Дежурное, внимание, кабинет товарища Сталина.
Stalin had built an empire on a framework of terror, justifying it in the name of a political faith. And through it, he ruled his country, his government, his party, and his family. He had even terrorized the doctors he now needed so badly. Now there was no one left, no wife, child, lover, or friend who was brave enough to enter the private world of Joseph Stalin. He had become a victim of his own terror. At the time of his death, Stalin was probably the best-known man on Earth. His popularity far outstripped that of any other world leader. In the Soviet Union, his image was everywhere. He had become a living icon, the subject of a cult of personality. 160 million people felt they knew him personally. But the man they knew was an invention. The real man was a mass of contradictions. A dictator whose position was unassailable, yet who was haunted by paranoia. Stalin used terror more effectively and scientifically than any other ruler. His extreme faith in a political ideal would destroy tens of millions of lives. Yet his achievements would hold his people in awe of him to the end.
Although there were millions and millions of people who detested him, there were equally millions and millions of people who loved and revered him. And many further millions of people who detested him at the same time mourned him when he died.
It is tempting to dismiss Stalin as a psychopath, unable to form normal human relationships with others. But family photos show a warm, gentle man, surrounded by daughters, sons, aunts, and in-laws. Stalin was a passionate husband, a loving father, and even a committed friend. Despite this, most of the people in these photos would be destroyed by him.